All right, so today we are going to start a mini unit. As I explained, um, before we start Unit 2, we're actually going to do a portion of Algebra 1, Unit 7. Some of you got through all of this 2 years ago when you took Algebra 1, some of you did not. So instead of doing the entire unit, we're just going to do a portion of it, basically the most essential lessons from that unit. And the reason we're doing that is because this Algebra 1 Unit 7 is really, really important stuff before we roll into Unit 2. So basically, this Algebra 1 Unit 7 is about how to different ways to solve quadratic equations. And the method we're going to talk about today is solving quadratics by taking square roots. So these are the steps here. These steps will make more sense when I actually do the examples. But let's take a look at the steps. We solve the quadratics by taking square roots. We isolate the squared term. We take the square root of both sides, and then we solve for x. And the key is going to be this part right here, in that the square root can be positive and negative. For example, the square root of 9 we know is 3. And the reason the square root of 9 is 3 is because 3 times 3 squared, or 3 times 3, equals 9. But the square root of 9 could also be negative 3. Because negative 3 times itself, negative 3 times negative 3, is also 9. So that's what I mean by that. With that in mind, let's take a look at these examples here. Really quick lesson today. So solve the following quadratics by square rooting and do not graph. So first one we have is n squared plus 4 equals 404. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to isolate the squared term, meaning we want to get, in this case, the n squared by itself. So how am I going to get that by itself? I have to get rid of the plus 4 here. Okay, so how do I get rid of addition? I get rid of addition by doing the opposite, subtracting. So I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. Okay, so I'm going to get n squared equals 404 minus 4. So that's 400. Okay. So that's the first step, isolate the square roots. Then the next thing we're going to do, and I'll use a different color for this, is we are going to take the square root of both sides. And the reason we're going to do that is that squaring and square rooting are the opposites of each other, just like addition and subtraction are opposites of each other. Okay, so when you have opposite operations, they basically cancel each other out. So, for example, on this left-hand side here, right there, the square root will essentially cancel out the squared. Because they're opposites, the square root will cancel out the squared, and we'll be left with just n. Okay, because that is our ultimate goal, is to be able to solve for n. So by square rooting both sides, by doing the opposite of squaring, the square root will cancel out the squared, and we'll be left with just n. But if I square root one side, I have to square root the other side. So the square root of 400, in this case, is 20. Use a calculator if you need to. Okay, but like I said before, remember the square root can be positive or negative. So n could be 20, but it could also be negative 20, because negative 20 times negative 20 is also 400. So what I will do is, instead of writing 20 and negative 20, I'll put this plus and minus in front of it. What that means is that n can equal positive 20, but it could also equal negative 20. So that is our solution. N equals plus and minus positive and negative 20. And that is it. We've already solved for n. Okay. Number 2, notice from here to here, Notice I switched around the order. That is a perfectly mathematically legal thing to do. I switched around the order. Okay, so again, I want to isolate the squared term, so which means I need to get rid of the 3, and I'm going to do that by dividing both sides by 3, since division is the opposite of multiplication. All right, so I end up with n squared equals 432 divided by 3, which is 144. And I'm basically do the same thing I did in number 1. Okay, the squared term is isolated. Now I'm going to take the square root of both sides, since squaring is the opposite of square rooting. So that will give me n equals the square root of 144. If you need a calculator, use a calculator, is 12. So it's going to be n equals positive 12 and negative 12, because 12 times 12 is 144, and negative 12 times negative 12 is 144. Okay. Number 3, I went ahead and I also switched around the order, right, which again is perfectly legal thing to do. Step 1 is to isolate the squared term. Well, notice the squared term is already by itself. The squared, there's nothing else with it. So I can go right ahead and I can take the square root. I can go right ahead and I can take the square root of both sides. Okay. Okay, now here's where it gets a little tricky. Okay. Okay. Again, the square root will cancel out the squared. So square root cancels out squared, and I'm left with n plus 1. Okay? Because the squared was outside the parentheses, when I square it, when I do the opposite, the square root will cancel out the squared, and you're left with n plus 1. Okay? On the other side, I have the square root of 144, which, as we saw up here, is going to be positive and negative 12. Okay, positive and negative 12. Okay, so I have isolated the square root. It was already isolated. Isolated the squared term. It was already isolated. And I took the square root of both sides. Now I'm going to solve for x, or in this case, n. So to get n by itself, I need to subtract 1 from both sides. Okay. Now, with this case, there's going to be 2 answers, because remember, this is plus n minus, positive n negative 12, which means I'm going to calculate it twice, once with plus and once with minus. So if I calculate it with plus, positive 12 minus 1 is going to equal 11, right? 12 minus 1 is 11. Now I'm going to calculate it with, negative. So if I do negative 12, and I subtract 1, that's going to give me a negative 13. So my 2 solutions here are n equals 11 and n equals negative 13. All right. Last example, again, isolate the squared term, which means I need to isolate this part here. So to do that, I need to add 30 to both sides, because that will make that go away. So I'll have n minus 5 squared equals 100. Okay. Now I can go ahead and I can take the square root of both sides. Okay. All right. Once again, square root will cancel out squared, so I'll have n minus 5. Okay, square root of 100, that's going to be positive and negative 10. So plus and minus 10. And to finish this off, to solve for n, I'm going to just add 5 to both sides. So n equals, so if I calculate it positive, so Positive 10 plus 5, that's going to give me n equals 15. Okay. If I calculate it negative now, negative 10 plus 5, negative 10 plus 5 is going to be a negative 5. So I end up with 15 and negative 5. Okay. Your cooldown today is going to be a few examples just like this. Let me show you what your cooldown is. Okay. It's actually just going to be one example, just like this. So you're going to solve this equation, and you can do that exactly the way I did these examples here.